Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Galveston County Master Gardeners for today's educational seminar, Louisiana Irises. As a matter of note, please be aware that this program is being recorded for educational purposes. Before we begin, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping reminders. All participants have been muted and your video has been turned off. Please leave those settings as is so we have minimal disruptions during the program. Today's presentation will run approximately 1 hour. If you have questions during the presentation, we ask that you use the chat function. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat bubble. If you click on that, it will open up the chat box and you can ask your questions there. One last note, later today, you will be contacted by email. There will be a link to a brief evaluation form, and we would very much appreciate you taking a few minutes to complete that form, as your candid responses help enhance our future programming efforts. Additionally, you'll receive a PDF copy of today's presentation for reference. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Monica Martens. She is a Galveston County Master Gardener from the class of 2013. Monica's been growing irises since about 2000, and I believe it was, she can correct me on this when she starts, but I believe 2 years ago, she became the team lead for our iris bed at the Discovery Garden that we have located here in Carbide Park. So without further ado, we will begin. Thank you for joining us for today's seminar. Monica, over to you.
Thank you. And Ginger, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I also have the chat screen up, so I hope to answer all your questions today. In the past, we've done this as a presentation for 1.5 hours to 2 hours, so it's a little bit shorter, but we will be getting to all of the things that I've talked about in the past about growing Louisiana irises. And let's get started. And sorry, Ginger, I'm just trying to make sure I can make my screen advance. There we go. I will be talking about some companies and trade names in this presentation. These are things that I have found useful personally over the years. And this is just a thank you reminder for coming today. All right. Now, something important, I will, if you want to have a pen and paper handy, I will give you names of irises by color throughout the presentation. And if at the end of the presentation, you'd still like some more irises, I can see what I can dig up by color for you, because one of the things that really interests me about irises is the variety of colors that we can grow. But sometimes we think it's usually just purples and yellows because that's what we see most commonly. Today, you're going to learn a brief history of Louisiana irises, gain some knowledge about the industry who creates the hybrids that we grow, be able to differentiate between Louisiana irises and other irises, and learn some basic tips from growing. And because of the interesting weather we had in February, I will be going over that as well. The iris that is pictured on this slide is called K. Nelson. It's one of my favorites because it's in the pink family, but it has this bicolor feature to it. So if you take a moment and just kind of look at the different parts of that flower, and I'll tell you what those different parts are called, you see a lot of color variation in this flower. You can even in this picture see what the underside of the flower looks like. Notice also there's a little ruffling there. So the botanical family that irises are part of is very large. They're part of the same family that have crocus, freesia, gladiola. And when we talk about irises, and you may be aware of this, there's so many different varieties, things that are considered wild, things that are called species irises, and things that have been bred by people and hybridized. Some of the things on the left, for instance, are things you might find naturally in the woods, like herbetia, but butterfly iris, African iris, I've also seen those plants in the stores. Walking iris down at the lower right is another one. But we're going to be in the genus Iris and mainly talking about the Louisiana iris, but I will contrast it with the more popular bearded iris that you may have heard of as well. So what distinguishes the Louisiana iris from other types of irises? This has to do with where it grows, the fact that it has a signal that is not a beard, which is like a furry looking caterpillar part of the plant. And also this has to do a bit with the color variation and the fact that it is very water loving species. This one, if you want to write down, is called South Downs. And I love finding irises that are pale blue in color, because that's also a different color than what we sometimes find in the stores, which is more royal blue to approaching dark purple. So that one is called South Downs. So this is a picture of a typical and very beautiful tall bearded iris. And if you live anywhere other than southeastern Texas, you've probably come across this iris. We distinguish the parts of this flower by talking about the standards, the falls, and the beard. That those really roughly peach colored petals that are sort of upright in this photo, those are called the standards. And then if you look at the darker fuchsia colored pink, those are called the falls. And many times, in most cases, there are 3 standard petals and 3 falls petals. And then there's an orange, like I say, I think it looks like a caterpillar, that is on the bottom of the falls. And that is what makes this a bearded iris. Its leaf structure is also different than what we see with Louisiana irises as well. Now, if you look under that beard, you're going to see some sort of white striped marks, and that's in the area where we will typically talk about what's called the signal for the Louisiana iris. This one is called Cherry Blossom Song, but not one we can grow quite down here. All right, so this is an illustration of a Louisiana iris. So we still have the upper petals, which are called the standards, and sometimes they stick upright. They don't have to, they can be more flat like a dinner plate. And we also have the falls, which are the sepals. And then if you notice, we don't have a beard, we have something called a signal. So here it's called a yellow patch. But actually that signal can be, can look like a thumbprint. It can look like a really thin line that's yellow. It isn't always even yellow. And in this illustration, the veins are pointed out as well. Then notice that there's another structure to this flower, and it's called the style arm. And that's sort of in the very middle of the plant. And it's not calling a lot of attention to itself, but it's a little tubular and has a sort of flower part at the top. And the reason why this is important to know is that if you're looking for an iris that's interesting, then the description will tell you about all the different colors that are on this plant. And if you're trying to decide if you have 2 different white irises or 2 different pink irises, you can use these landmarks to help you figure that out. That yellow patch is kind of like a runway strip for a bee. Let's move on. So this is Eastertide. This is a great one to write down. Generally speaking, it's a really good bloomer. I love this one because it's bicolor. So it has, and it's kind of tricky to photograph irises, but I feel like this pretty much represents what it will look like. And of course, the flowers will start out one way and then they'll fade to different colors. But I think of Eastertide as being a lavender and yellow combination. So the lavender flowers are marked as the standards. The yellow flowers are on the lower part of the bloom. That signal that you see is sometimes called an arrow in this case. So it's a little wider at the closest to the top of the flower, and it gets further out toward the edge of the bloom. And then look at those style arms. So they're yellow, but they've got another shade of purple or lavender in them as well. This is a really beautiful flower. I wish I knew all the names of the irises that I grow in my garden, and I apologize, I don't know the name of this one, but here is a great example of a bicolor iris. And sometimes it doesn't have to be that the darker petals are the ones on the bottom and the lighter on the top. That can be reversed. That signal is one that I would call a thumbprint signal. The style arms are standing straight up in this photo, but you can see here that the standards and the falls both kind of open up. And sometimes people will refer to this as like a dinner plate type of structure because the flower is just really open and the top petals are laying over on the bottom of the other ones. Just like with tall bearded irises, you can have Louisiana irises that are really ruffled. And so this is a nice example of that. And it might have a little bit of, it looks like some insects have taken a few bites of these, but it's still beautiful nonetheless. I don't know the name of this one either, but this is an example where the standards and the falls are almost the same color. And what's really going on here is that the style arms are just making this flower pop. This is something that when I walk past it in my garden, I'm immediately drawn to that flower because you're seeing the true color there, which is this beautiful green yellow fluorescence. It's like a light bulb is on, it's that bright. So when you're choosing irises for your own garden, you can have a lot of little decisions to make. This would be a great one for you to write down. This is called Sundream. So I told you earlier that something I really like to do is seek out different colors of irises beyond yellow and purple. Now that's not to say I don't love those colors. So in this case, the reason I really like Sundream is because it's different than a typical yellow flower. So for instance, the color is pale. The style arms are very beautiful, but what I like about it is that the veining is red. So this is pretty unique. Sometimes the color of a flower can be very homogeneous. Sometimes it's distinguished, because the falls and the standards are very different from each other. But here, what's going on is that the veining is making this a unique flower, and that one is called Sundream. I'm going to talk in a moment about how we got hybrids of Louisiana irises, and they come from 5 different species that were identified in the wild, and Iris fulva is one of those species. I think this is an example of Iris fulva. And what's important about this one is that it is what gives us the color red. If you study flowers, you might know, or if you have a favorite flower, let's say, you might have heard sometimes about the difficulty of getting a particular type of color. So if you think about roses, that would probably be the color blue. And I think I'm still correct in saying that with tall bearded irises, the difficult color to get is red. So that's something that with the Louisiana irises, we have a real advantage of. We can get these beautiful red hybrids, and that's because of Iris fulva. This one, it's very zoomed in, but I was quite far away from it when I took this photo, and that was at Armand Bayou in April 2014. Now, Iris fulva can have, it's never really a bright, it's not going to look like a bright primary red color. And it can have a different shades of red. It can even sometimes look orange according to some sources that I've looked at. So you might have heard of flag irises, and As with lots of different plants, we sometimes have common names that um, actually get ascribed to a number of different things. But yellow flags and blue flags are pretty popular in our area. Sometimes they're considered invasive, and sometimes they just won't bloom for you. They love being near water. And I will tell you that the flags that I'm aware of in my yard really took it hard in the February storm. They came back, they did not bloom, but a lot of their plant matter died. And I'll contrast that with what I saw in the Louisianas in a bit. Now, a yellow flag does not have to have this very interesting veining on it. That looks to me like a thumbprint signal. Sometimes these yellow flags will be a very homogeneous yellow. It's actually an old variety that's native to Europe, and it became well established in the US as a wildflower and a garden plant. And as I said, sometimes the foliage also can be variegated. Sometimes you'll hear people call these Japanese irises. My research suggests that's a little different plant, but I have heard of some people having those in their yards as well. This was actually taken at Shriner's Iris Gardens in May of 2018 in Salem. I'll talk a little bit about iris tourism as well. So here's a beautiful picture of yellow irises growing in Armand Bayou. If you can get out there in the springtime, you can see some lovely examples of our yellows and purples and blues. So to get into a little timeline for you, this is the time of year well, we're not quite in midsummer yet, but this is the time of year when your irises are going to be done blooming, and it's a great time to kind of plan for what you'd like to do in the fall. So I'll remind you of this again, but the Society for Louisiana Irises has a website with vendors listed, and these will be small businesses, mostly in the South, but in some other locales that grow irises. And this would be a great time to go visit their websites and look at the pictures and see what they have available and what you might like to add to your yard. Or you can make a plan to check out the different garden sales that go on in the fall around here. I like to plant irises in late August, early September, and that's usually about the time that smaller vendors will be comfortable shipping them to you. So it's you can transplant things in the summertime, but it's kind of best to wait until we're getting a little less sunlight during the day, and it's a more comfortable time for the plants to establish. Throughout the early winter, you're just tending them, which means you might give them some fertilizer or do that in the midwinter. Try to keep the weeds down, because as it is South Texas, that's a year-round problem. And then springtime blooms are usually February to April, February for the really early blooming ones, and then sometimes into mid-May. And of course, this year we were a little bit different. When I'll reiterate this again in a little while, but iris hybrids bloom at different times in the season. So they're usually classified as an early season, mid-season, or late season bloomer. And of course, sometimes they straddle one of, two of those sort of time frames. So this is a lovely illustration from a book called Marie Calais that the Society for Louisiana Irises published. She was one of many people that are responsible for all the beautiful hybrids that we have today and all the research that was done in the early to mid 20th century. But our hybrids generally come from these 5 types. As I mentioned, Iris fulva is what gives us the red color. And Iris gigantis Ulia, I really butchered that. That's what gives us the very, very large flowers. And these can also grow they can be taller than the other Louisiana irises. And take a look, if you like, at that one in the upper right called Iris brevicalis. So what's interesting about this is that the stem has more of a zigzag formation. And that means that the flower has a lot more room to open. Sometimes with irises, the flowers can get a little bit squashed between the different stems, but Iris brevicalis handles that quite nicely. That's responsible for beautiful blue colors. It also helps irises to be cold hardy. And sometimes it's been called a cow pasture iris because it's not semi-aquatic. So knowing a little bit about these starts to give you a picture about the variety of the irises that we have, the things that they're conditioned, the conditions they're conditioned to accept. And irises can grow all the way into Western New York, Louisiana irises. The place where they're not going to do well is in the Rocky Mountain region, even if you gave them a lot of water. I became interested at some point in how we arrived at knowing what we know about Louisiana irises and how that fit into a lot of the botanical research that was going on in the 1800s and 1900s. And so here's just a few tidbits of information for you. In 1788, we had that's where we have the first written record of an iris, and it was called Blue Flag Iris. In the 1800s, there were some species officially identified, and John Audubon used the term Louisiana iris in a painting. Research and interest in the species of irises that were growing around Louisiana became quite popular as a result of the leadership in charge of the New York Botanical Garden. And that prompted some efforts to start to save irises and develop hybrids in the period between World War I and World War II and into the Depression. And in 1941 was when the Society for Louisiana Irises was formed, and they are really they are the primary website for all information, research, historical records about Louisiana irises. Their organization plus all of the people who have been affiliated with them over the years. And we were set to have quite an anniversary conference before things happened over the past 2 years. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to celebrate maybe next year. One thing that I have noted when I think about the 20 years that I've been growing irises and thinking about them and an observer of who sells them is that it's really small family businesses and people who just love these plants and enjoy creating new colors. That's why we have all of this variety. I don't see that my generation or people younger than me are getting very interested in this. And I know that every generation has their own experience. And the people that did all this work in the early to mid 20th century had much different lives than even I did and people today. And so I think about that a lot when I think about hoping that I'll always have these varieties, lots of different options to put in my yard. And one trip that I got to take when I was researching irises was I went to some archives at the University in Lafayette, Louisiana, and was able to pour through a lot of primary records and research from people who back in the 20s and 30s were working to find new varieties and see where they were and record them and save them and start to hybridize them. There was a lot of industrial development going on at that time. And so there was a concerted effort to save these plants and also to catalog what was available. And I think that this must have been pretty important work to people, as evidenced by just this part of a larger map that I found, where they had labeled two different locations of found plants, Iris Heaven and New Iris Heaven. I mentioned a couple of times that, and this is partly because of what we see in the sort of larger stores around here, we tend to think of irises coming in yellow and purple, and sometimes white and sometimes blue, but mostly yellow and purple. And so I think about, it's sort of similar as if you thought that the world of apples was these two varieties, which actually, now that I think about my childhood, that's kind of what was in our grocery store. But this is a better representation of the different types of apples that we could eat, depending on what's available in your grocery store, what part of the country you live in. Well, sometimes when we think of Louisiana irises, these are the colors that we think of. By the way, note that signal on the right side. That is that, it's like a needle shape to me. That's also another variation in the signal instead of like a thumbprint. And if you're out shopping, these are ones that you'll typically find, and there are some reds there. And these are actually great irises. I would recommend, if you wanted to write down a couple of names, Innkeeper at the top is a purple one. That's a great bloomer. If you go to the bottom, Full Eclipse is another good purple. And Clyde Redmond will bloom nearly all the time, and that's a beautiful blue. But we also have all of this variation. And I'll show you another group of photos in a moment. So sometimes, as in the picture in the upper left, you can get a very homogeneous color variation where the signal is the main standout, but the petals are exactly the same color all around. And this reminds me, I think that is called Cajun Whirl, that white one in the upper left, excuse me. It reminds me of one I had in my tall bearded iris days called Got Milk. It's just such a great color. And then you see, if you scan across this page, lovely ruffling, colors mixed together. There's a one at the top that's like yellow and orange. One that is a little hard to grow, but I love it, it's on the second row on the far right, and it's called Splitter Splatter. That's the one that's white with red coloring. That actually doesn't come out the same on every flower. That red coloring is very random. Note also the one to the left. So there, the ruffling has a completely different color. It's got that light sort of cream, sometimes it looks like a yellow outline around it. Here's another one you could write down. The blue one in the middle, it's just kind of a nice medium color blue, is called Blue Mountain Mist. If you look down on the bottom row, there's one that might be kind of standing out to you because the yellows are very vibrant. That's from the signal and the style arms. So it's a purple flower. And I think that one is called Geisha Eyes. That is a great one to write down as well. And then we have some other bicolors. Let's see what's on the next page. Okay, several yellows in this photo. Also some different pinks and reds. Now, if you scan around, you'll see some flowers that are clearly hybrids. And then if you go to the lower left, I think I have another photo of that later in the presentation. That's called Red Echo. So that is a Louisiana iris that looks a bit more wild. We might call it a species iris. It depends on your point of view. But the flower petals are a little bit more circular, not as ruffled, smaller. You can see through the petals to the ground. One I'd like to point out to you on the upper left is called Bayou Tiger. And if you've haven't figured it out by now, hybridizers, they get to name their plants, and they name them for people that they like. Sometimes they name them because a grandchild has a good idea. And sometimes they're named because the flower embodies something in particular. And of course, Bayou Tiger would be named to celebrate a sports team in Louisiana. Iris vinicolor is a species iris. It's sometimes called the wine-colored flag. This is actually one I love to grow in my yard. It always blooms. It's got such a delicate looking flower. And you can see that if you're just looking at it from the top, that signal, you just see the point on the edge of the signal. But if you pull the flower down, you can see that there's a lot more going on with that yellow color. And here's another color photo of red echo. And this one was taken at the Caroline Dorman Nature Preserve near Saline, Louisiana. And I'll say that one again, because if you like to visit places where there's flower history, that's a great place to look up. Caroline Dorman Nature Preserve. And Caroline Dorman was another really important person in the world of irises in terms of discovering things on her expansive property and recording and breeding. And this is very pretty because of the scarlet nature of those flowers. This is one I really recommend, and it's kind of the introduction to our section about the storm and the effect of the storm on blooming this year. This is called Cardinal in Flight, and I believe it comes from Beaudark Gardens in Louisiana. It's one that I ordered and talked to the person who owns that garden and then had it shipped to me. And I love this flower. I love this flower because of the color, because it's a deep red. I also love it because it bloomed after the first year that I planted it, and it has bloomed ever since. And it's a little smaller plant. It doesn't grow super tall. It seems to like where it is in my yard. So if you're looking for a red, I really like Cardinal in Flight. So I wanted to talk about the effect of the storm also in relation to our preservation project. And Ginger mentioned that I was lead with the iris beds. Well, as I said, I'm interested in who's traditionally grown irises and who will continue to grow irises into the future. And I had been on and off involved with the Society for Louisiana Irises, and not always because of my work that I do, but sometimes I couldn't get to the conferences. But I had kept in touch with them, and our late extension director, Dr. William Johnson, had approached me back in 2019. There was some room in the garden to put some irises. And I was very interested in this because I thought it would be nice to have a demonstration area. And this would be a great opportunity to showcase all the different color and variety that you can get out of this plant. So I spoke with a contact at the Society for Louisiana Irises and found out that there was an opportunity to come and collect a lot of irises. And so this all happened in 2019. And they're very generous. And so there are other master gardener groups elsewhere. I think I'm aware of one in Georgia that's been doing the same thing. So maybe we're all having similar ideas about wanting to preserve these plants. But I developed a collection plan and implemented it, and we went out twice and got flowers. We had so much that we had to actually put some overflow into 2 gardens. And so I like calling this a living museum, although I really do want us to have some of them for sale eventually as well, so that all of us gain a sense of what's possible to grow, and just to provide a little bit more education about them. I don't know how much we'll have for sale. I'd hoped to do that this year, but the storm kind of dampened that a little bit, and I was not able to be here for all the recording of the blooms, but it's my intention that what I mean by recording of the blooms is that when the flower appears, so we have a map of all of these, but of course irises don't stay in rows. You could think of irises, picture a lot of little children in elementary school who haven't quite learned to stay in a line yet. So that's what irises do. They grow in a circular pattern and they spread out, and some of them crowd each other, and some irises die out or go away. And then some of them just take a break from blooming for a year. So people who grow these for a living, of course, keep color variations very specifically away from others so that you don't get things growing into each other. I would love it when we have these for sale to be able to tell you the name of the iris, not just to say it's a pink iris. So we'll see if that's possible. But next year we will have a lot of good color coding on them, and then pot them and hopefully have them for sale in the fall. And so, as I said, in the spring and fall of 2019, we went iris hunting and then divided the plants up, put most of them in our discovery garden, put the overflow in a couple of other locations. You can see that I'm holding a Sharpie that's in white ink. You can write on the stems or the leaves of irises, and it's just fine. You can use those white paint markers, or you can use a black Sharpie. Both of them work. And started talking with other master gardeners about this project. And in 2020, we had just an amazing bloom season. It started with one flower in late February, and you can see actually that one in the picture is Gulf Moon Glow. That's one of my favorites as well. That's a yellow and lavender color combination. So we had blooms starting in late February, and then most of them bloomed during mid-March to mid-April, and then we had another flower appear in the second week of May. And that's been my typical experience, is you'll have one that's super early and super late, and then most of them will bloom over the course of a month. And of the 57 plants that I placed in the 2 garden beds, we had 80% bloom. And a lot of this was helped along by the fact that the weather cooperated, the beds already had good soil composition, they're in full sun, there was regular watering. There were a few things that bloomed that I did not have on my map, so I'm not really sure what they are, but that's kind of par for the course with growing irises. And of course, then over the fall winter, as I started counting number of plants, they had doubled essentially, because they make babies along the rhizome. So that was exciting as well. Oh, let me go back real quick. That is, I think that's the second time we've had Sundream, but yes, because that's the one with the magenta veining. So just in case you missed that the first time, that's a good one to write down. And this is a breakdown of what we planted. My intention was to get as much color variety as possible. So I don't know yet that we have had the orange ones bloom. So I'm excited to see if I can, if they will appear eventually. So as you know, that storm in February hit us around Valentine's Day, and February 25th was the first time that I was out at the gardens to take a look at things, and this is about what it looked like in my yard as well. By the way, that bed looks beautiful now, not just because of the plants have recovered, but we've also replaced the wood, which has been rotting, so it doesn't bow out anymore. So let's zoom in a little bit and look at these plants. This is typical cold weather damage to the iris leaves. You can see that not every part of, not every leaf was damaged, and some of them look pretty fine, and some of them are white and rotting. There's also some dead leaves on the ground. So I'm not like a super fan of cleaning and tidying beds up before the winter. I like to let whatever plant matter is going to rot just kind of rot onto the ground and let it stay there. But the other reason I pulled some of it off in these beds, but especially when plants haven't been in a location for a while, when you start pulling on weeds and yanking off dead material, can actually pull the plant out of the ground. So, I mean, irises are pretty forgiving of this, but you know, it's the same with other plants. I like to plant a lot of mondo grass in my yard, and it's the same thing. If I've just transplanted some mondo grass and I start trying to yank out weeds, well, that mondo grass is going to come right out. So some of that dead material is from, you know, the end of 2020. And here's a little closer look. So it was a little worrisome, but it wasn't the end of the world. And here's one more look. Now, this photo, if you look toward the back of the right side, I think these might have been some of my species irises. I don't have a lot in this bed, but I think that they had more damage to the leaves. They still had the same outcome as the other plants in general, but their leaves took like a bigger hit, and I don't really know why. But so those photos were from February 25th. Here it's March 13th. You can see that this is the other bed, but they looked identical. Life has certainly improved. The plants have regenerated. They're starting to grow. They're not blooming yet, but they're looking really, really good. So life is good again. So a little sidebar, there is a bearded iris that grows down here and blooms regularly. It's called the white cemetery iris. And so you can see in that photo that it has the little caterpillar looking beard on it. And so people like this iris because it's a bearded that we can grow down here. And this is from one of our master gardeners in her home. And so I had planted a white cemetery iris I had been given that had come from a nursery in the region, but this is what we got. So this was the first iris that bloomed in 2021, March 25th, and it's bearded. And I don't think that there is a cemetery iris that is purple. So it's beautiful, and I'm happy it's there. But I still have yet to get a white cemetery iris in this bed. I wanted to show you another picture so you can really see what's going on with that plant. There's so much beauty in these flowers. I think it's really fun sometimes to just, as with everything, take a little bit of time to really see what you're seeing. So the next few pictures are some of photographs in general of the blooms taken throughout April. And I'll summarize what we're seeing here in a moment. This is a really beautiful purple. I love the contrast in those style arms with the yellow and sort of, you might call them green. I mean, color's a little bit subjective. Yellowish green style arms with the purple in the middle. Here's an example of the types of blues that I like, because there's just something really unique about the signal and the style arm that draw my eye to it. Now, there's several places where you're going to see a lot of yellow, and that's probably Laura Louise. That's another great iris to write down the name of, Laura Louise. That is a wonderful old iris, performs well year after year, multiplies a lot. Beautiful yellow color. The signal is, I would say it's a little bit orange. Some of our white ones bloomed. That one toward the bottom is sort of getting into somewhere between pink and purple territory. What I also like about the Louisiana iris family, and this is true in the tall bearded irises, is you can get these really deep purple colors, just dark purples. I think I mentioned full eclipse is one of those nice ones. Now in the bearded iris, we can almost come pretty close to like a black color. There's one I loved called Before the Storm. I don't think I've seen any quite that dark in the Louisiana Iris family, but there's so many out there. It's hard to know. And here's a picture of some of our bicolors and one of our reds. Here's another one that you could write down if you like red. It's called My Friend Dick. Again, My Friend Dick. There's also an iris called My Friend Tom. I think that's purple. And I might be wrong, but I think that there's also an Our Friend Tom and an Our Friend Dick, so it can get a little bit confusing. That was clearly written for somebody important in the world of breeding. And here's a nice view of the different colors in this bed. There's one on the left side, it's underneath a purple one, and it's a pink one. It's not very zoomed in, but that is Aunt Shirley. Aunt Shirley is also one of my favorites for the same reason that Cardinal in Flight is. Once I had procured it, it bloomed quickly for me in that it bloomed the following year. I didn't have to wait a year for it to show up. And it always blooms for me. And it's has variations of pink in it. And I think that the ones in the middle that are purple, if it's not this, it's very similar to it. There's a nice purple one called Connor's Choice that has a nice, usually pink style arm to it. So it's a medium purple with sort of a feeling of pink in the middle of it. So you can see that we had a lot of color variation. And here's a nice ruffled one. So when I sat back and thought about what went on in my yard, what went on in my friend's yard in San Leon, and what happened at the Discovery Garden, these are sort of my concluding thoughts for you. I think that yield in overall blooms was down a little bit because of the storm. So if I compared 2020 in our Discovery Garden to 2021, I estimated that in 2020, 80% of our plants bloomed, and in 2021, it was 65 to 70%. That's not bad, but that's what it was. If the irises were in full sun and in raised beds and got fertilizer, then I don't think the color variation was affected. Flowering was delayed at least 3 weeks. Now I'm going based on, remember I told you that sometimes you'll see one flower in February. So that's based on my anticipation of the first flowers, the first blooms happening in late February. So it might be more accurate to say that flowering was delayed 2 weeks, because that would be for the average time that plants bloom. The foliage was mostly fine, except for the flags, which had a lot more damage on the foliage. There's still a few hybrids that I haven't seen bloom yet, and I don't know if that was affected by the storm. In my yard, flowering was delayed about the same time, had the same damage to the foliage. I also had a group of hybrids that I had moved. This was partly because of our blueberry plants had to be moved. And so I transplanted these irises to an area that has adequate but not full sun. And they're not in raised beds. And I do a lot to augment the soil, but nevertheless, there is clay several inches down. So those irises took some time off. So where I had irises planted where the soil, I would say, was more poor and the beds were not raised, and the flowering was greatly inhibited this year. And the ones that tended to bloom were the purples and whites and yellows. But I had mentioned to you a light blue that I love called, oh shoot, that name is escaping me right now, South Downs. That bloomed, and there's another light blue that I like. It's called By Water. So it's one word, Bywater. South Downs and Bywater both bloomed. And so here's a list as well of some of the ones that I have listed for you today. So Bywater, Cardinals in Flight, Connor's Choice, South Downs, Clyde Redmond. I don't think I've mentioned to you Gertie Butler. That's a purple one, but it has this, I feel like the signal in that, there's a lot of veining and it looks like kind of a spray pattern. So I like that one for that reason. Aunt Shirley and Laura Louise. So I wanted to talk briefly about differences in nurseries. So I got involved with irises about 20 years ago in the Rocky Mountain region. And what would typically happen is that a local nursery, and local means it's within a 1 to 2 hour drive, and it's usually going to be out in the country, especially in some states where they have access to well water, so they're not on city water. And sometimes this is a retired couple that has land and they plant out about 4,000 varieties. So a typical visit would happen in the Rocky Mountain region from, say, Mother's Day to the middle of June, somewhere in a 3 to 4 week period where the public is free to come out every day of the week. Everything's in bloom, and then you would fill out your order form and pay for the irises, and then you'd either come back in August or you would have them shipped to you if you didn't live nearby, and then you plant them and see what came up the next year. And so this picture conveys that this is something that we would do with friends, and it's quite popular to go out with people and go iris shopping and meander around the grounds and go out for lunch afterwards. And so in my 20 years of doing this, there's a lot of places where I've grown irises. Those are in the little red circle. And then the blue circles are all the places where I've gone and either visited iris farms or happened upon a botanical garden where there's just a lot of irises in bloom. One trip that I recommend to everybody, because it's like an iris nursery on steroids, is Shriner's Iris Gardens in Salem, Oregon. And a few years ago, I took myself to Oregon and pretended to be a resident of Salem for a week and just had the most fun and went to Shriner's. They get so many people that on the weekends, they have crowd control with, hired police to help with the traffic and everything. And they're really busy on Mother's Day and they're really busy on Memorial Day. So you kind of want to shoot for in the middle of that sometime. And mostly they are a grower of tall bearded irises, but they do have Louisianas for sale, and it is definitely worth checking out their catalog to see what they have from year to year. Now, some people have asked me if irises have a scent to them. Some of them do, but I can't say I've ever walked through my yard and thought, oh, those irises smell pretty. There's just way too much competing scent in the yard, or maybe there's just not enough of them. I can tell you that when you're at a site where there's probably 10,000 blooms, then yes, you will think, wow, there's definitely a smell to the irises there. The only downside is they're so hospitable that they have food trucks come in. And so sometimes you've got the smell of irises and the smell of food cooking at the same time. But it's overwhelming and amazing to see this many in one place. This is an area of their commercial site as well. And then this is a now retired area in northern Louisiana, but this is an example of a regional grower in Louisiana. You can see they're also planted in rows. Sometimes they'll be planted in boxes. And this was one of my favorite places to go and visit as well for Louisiana irises. I'll go back to this picture real quick. So as far as I understand, For growers in the Southeast, with Louisiana irises, I have not seen typically that there'll be a period of time where the place is open to the public. I could be wrong. Things can certainly change year to year, but by and large, I found that the experience from buying from people who grow Louisiana irises is that it's just done over the phone or the web. I've always had great experience, especially just picking up the phone and talking to somebody and saying, this is kind of what I'm interested in. Do you have enough of this one to sell this year? And I always leave open some flexibility for the person to help me also make some decisions about what good ones would be, because they know what they've got on their property. Okay, gosh, we're almost at 12:56. I'll just finish up with some few tips. There's always exceptions to the rule, but generally you want as much sun as possible, and regular watering, especially if we go into a dry period. They don't really tend to do well under trees where there's a lot of canopy or shrubs with large root systems. It's a good idea to keep up with weeding often, because lots of grasses like to grow with irises. And I like amending the soil several times a year. Something that I love to use that's a bit on the expensive side is composted cotton burrs, and sometimes I put down chicken manure. I like both of these substances because they're flaky and soft. So if I want to sprinkle them over my irises, they're not going to like break off the foliage or just weigh them down. I'm not going to have to like dig them out after I do that. And what I have noticed is that this doesn't really permeate down into the clay. So whatever is down 6 inches, that's what you're stuck with if you're not in a raised bed. I like a balanced fertilizer. Sometimes I've over fertilized and it doesn't seem to affect the plants that much. I know that's not always the case with other plants. I try not to over fertilize, but if I'm not sure, then I'll look for a 4-4-4, because I just feel like I have better control over, I have a better understanding of how much I'm applying. But I'd say that with fertilizer, I sort of tend to go by feel rather than measurement, but you don't have to be that way. I also just like to dig in the soil with my hands and kind of see what the consistency is. I also really like to have a lot of plants in my yard that attract bumblebees and honeybees and hummingbirds, and that's just good overall for everything. But Louisiana irises are actually mainly pollinated by bumblebees and honeybirds. So a quick reminder that places where you can go to find irises, look at the website for the Society for Louisiana Irises, check out your local plant sales and nurseries, and there's a lot of trading that goes on among friends. Especially new irises will be a little on the expensive side. They can run about $25 a rhizome. So what I often know about friends is that one will buy one expensive one and one will buy the other, and then they'll trade eventually. And that's why they're expensive at first, because once an iris is out in the community, then people can trade with each other. And so people who put the work into hybridizing those, they don't get much chance to recoup any cost for the time spent doing it. This is definitely not something that is a money-making business. I've gone over some of this already, but when you're looking at catalog descriptions, which can also be on the internet, you'll see a lot of information that will help you make a decision about the type of plant you're buying, especially if you're going for color. And if you're just looking for overall color, you can go by picture, but especially because photography is difficult, you can use the flower description to really get an understanding of what it's going to be. Especially the purples and blues are hard to photograph. Here's an example of, this is a white one that I really like called Good Doctor. And so here's an example of a catalog description for that. It talks about the color of the signal. It does talk about the fragrance. It also talks about how this flower was made, from what 2 or 3 flowers those were the ones that produced it. We'll talk about the height, and in this case, it says early bloom. It might say EM for early middle. When you get your irises, they'll come in a box. They'll be labeled by the person who produced them for you, and the roots will be dry. So you'll want to get them into the soil as soon as possible. Sometimes those roots will also look purple, and that's normal. This is Ivinicolor blue, and that's one of its something that distinguishes it from other ones. In general, you don't have to worry about seed pods. You can just let them fall off naturally, and a few years from now, you might get an iris that's different that you didn't plant, or you can cut them off. It's completely your choice. There's really not much that hurts Louisiana irises, even though there are some things that are listed. I have never seen, well, I have seen rhizome rot occasionally. That's either from too much mulch, excuse me, that's from sun scald. So you want to use mulch to avoid that. I've usually not seen iris rust. I sometimes see slugs and snails in my garden, and our response to that is diatomaceous earth. But I have not seen leaf miners or iris borers. You'll sometimes see leaf rippling. This is not a problem. It may be related to the timing of water in the spring. So in conclusion, I hope this inspires you to think about how irises can add color to your garden, and that they're worth waiting for. Look for a spring tour of irises in the Discovery Garden in 2022. I would love to show you all these plants when they're actually blooming. I really hope that happens next year. If you're super inspired about this or gardening, look into how to become a master gardener. And the Society for Louisiana Irises is a great resource to get more information. A lot of what I told you today comes from them. Oh, there's two other irises you can write down, everyone. There's one called Her Highness. I think that's a white one. Her Highness, like the Queen. And there's one called Exquisite Lady. Exquisite Lady. I'm sorry, I've forgotten what that is. I think it's a pink or a white variation, but I wrote it down for a reason.
Monica, thank you so much for giving us this presentation today, and we definitely want to get you on the books to do something in March and have the tour so that we can have people come out and actually see all of these in person. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you at future programs. And we hope that you have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Monica.